Moreno. That's good morning in Maori, which is the for language of the native New Zealanders. My sister-in-law is from New Zealand. She's British background, but the people that lived on that island, the natives, they're Maori people. So good morning in Maori today. Hope you're doing a good day. Happy Sunday today. Hopefully you're going to sounds like the weather's going to be great. And so we're excited about that. And get to talk with you twice today if you're listening to some of the sermons. We're reading Psalms 119 today is one of our psalm passages. And that's what I'm preaching on today too. So you're going to get a double whammy. Verse that I picked from yesterday is Psalms 118, 8 through 9. It says, "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes." Isn't that exactly right? That we can't humans are going to let us down and our government officials are going to let us down. The only person that we can put our trust in is the Lord. So a very, very good verse. All right. Psalms 119 we're going to be reading today. It's the longest chapter in the Bible, and it's also the longest psalm as well. So you're just reading Psalms 119, and then we're going to read, and I made a mistake on our notes again, so I've made two mistakes on our outline. I have down Romans 13 through 15. We're going to read Romans 13 through 16, the rest of the book today. So make sure you make note of that and finish out the book of Romans today. Romans 19, it's the longest chapter in the Bible. It's 176 verses. It's a complete poem. It's beautifully written. It's an acrostic using the Hebrew alphabet, so there's 22 sections, and every section has 8 verses in it, and all those 8 verses start with the letter of that section. So if it's the first, you got to remember the first letter of the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet, and then the 8 verses underneath that all start, the word starts with that letter. So very, very well put together. Of course, we can't see that in English, but you kind of think about that. And as long as this verse, as long as he writes about this, the key word is Torah, or instruction is what that means. It uses 7 synonyms in the poem to describe that. To describe that word law. Promise, word, decrees, commands, statutes, precepts. With the exception of 4 verses, one of those words are used in every one of the verses. And so over and over and over again, you see God's love for the statutes, our love for God's commands, our love for God's decrees, but over and over and over again, using a variety of ways of teaching us. All right, the name of the author is not given. We don't know who wrote this, if it was King David or not. But he was, like I mentioned in the sermon today too, I'm giving you some of the similar points. He obviously was a young man, had a lot of adversity in his life. He must have been persecuted by royalty, some kind of royalty. He suffered reproach. He was ridiculed at the hands of the wicked. He had been lied to. His life had been threatened. There was a time when he strayed from God, after which he suffered affliction and illness. He was unbelievably broad in perspective in life, with both extremes of joy. I mean, you read this through this psalm. That's why you can kind of get a glimpse of who the author might be. But he found a way to make life worth living, and that was by following God's law, God's decrees, God's commands. All right, so I hope that you enjoy that. It's really interesting. There's a lot of good verses in there, a lot of good ones to remember. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. That's a good one to remember. There's lots of good sections in there. All right, the Romans. We're finishing up Romans today. In Romans 13, the beginning part of Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, there's an interesting discussion about how Christians are to approach government, or how are we to think about government. And Paul says that we are to respect them, and that we need to submit to those governments, and that governments are God ordained. Very, very interesting. I remember doing this in a sermon one time, and I had a very anti-government person that was attending, and he kept moving forward as I was preaching on this, that he was going to disagree with me, but he kept moving. I bet you he moved 3 times. True story. I watched him move. I was in a bigger church, so he kept working, because he didn't like that. He didn't like that submission part of it. And you say, yeah, but, it wasn't like there was... The leader at that time is Nero. Nero was worse than Hitler. And he says, submit to those governing authorities. Isn't that interesting? So that's a good one to kind of prove. And there's not a lot said on politics in the Bible. In the Old Testament, it's always about the king, but in the New Testament, there's really not a lot. Jesus kind of stayed away from it. There is politics involved with the religious departments, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but there's not a lot said. This is one of the only sections that it really kind of lays out how we are to approach them. Okay, so read that, and then Romans, the rest of Romans 13 or 14, excuse me. 14 is a great discussion as well, and this has to do with when Christians disagree on issues that are disputable. There's some that don't drink, smoke, or chew or dance with girls that do. It used to be that you'd go to the movie. You can't go to the movies. That's unchristian. But these are disputable things. There's nothing in the Bible that says that you couldn't do those kind of things. And Paul actually says, I think everything is good. It can turn into bad, but most things are good. So what do you do with disputable matters? And I think there's some Jewish Christians that are really struggling with that Old Testament law and their new freedom they have in Christ, and they're kind of forcing that law onto Gentile believers, and so there's some arguments going back and forth, and they're judging people because they did this or they eat this or they went to this place. And so it's a really good discussion about how we should do that. Basically, he says fellowship among Christians is not to be based on everyone's agreements on disputable matters. Christians do not agree on all matters of faith pertaining to the Christian life especially, and nor do they have to, he says. So don't force other believers to have the same kind of points of view that you have. And on the other hand, he says, don't cause somebody else to stumble because of your views. Meaning, so I think drinking alcohol is one of those things. The Bible doesn't really come down and condemn it, that you can't do it in moderation. But alcohol or drunkenness is absolutely called a sin. So some people might have might not have any problem having a social or a beer once in a while. But boy, if they're, and you can do so without thinking that's a sin. But if you're doing in front of someone that's really struggling with alcoholism, that's when you take your freedom and you don't do that because you don't want that person to stumble. There might be some other items that would fall into that department as well. Interesting discussion. Read through that really, really slowly. And then it continues on in Romans 15, and he basically says those that are strong need to bear with the weak. The strong are the ones that have freedom. The weak ones are the ones that are legalist. That's what he says. And so we have to give in, not give in. We're the strong, bear some of those things. So we don't want them to stumble, so we choose not to do that. We're going to love our neighbor by not doing the things that we can do. It's not a sin to do, but because it might cause somebody else to stumble. And he says, accept one another over and over and over again. And then he concludes Romans 15 by saying that he's a minister of the Gentiles. He's wrapping up his letter here. And then he plans to come to Rome later on in that chapter. And then in Romans 16, it's his kind of farewell greeting, and he's greeting all these people in the Roman church. That's really fascinating as well. Look at all the names and everything that he says about them, because it really describes what the people there were like. All right, that's Romans today. That's our reading today. I hope you have a great Sunday. I hope you check in. I'm going to be talking about why we should read the Bible. We can't do a lot of things, but we surely can read the Bible, just like what you guys have been doing. You've been doing an awesome job at that. So check in with the sermon today, all right? See you later. See you tomorrow.